Some of you who have been around for a while, like me, might remember Salt-N-Pepa, which was a rap group from the 80s and the 90s that had hits such as Push It and Shoop. Well, Salt-N-Pepa recently got into a legal dispute with a record company called UMG Recordings that unfortunately didn't go their way. And it has some important lessons for indie filmmakers and creators generally that I'm going to talk about in this video. This case reminds us of how important it is to make sure that the language in your contracts is clear, particularly when those contracts have to do with your creative work. Before we get into that, I'm going to give you the obligatory boring legal disclaimers. First, this is not legal advice, because if I were going to be giving you legal advice, I would have to know about your specific situation and your specific needs, and right now I'm just a random lawyer talking to you on the internet. And second, I'm going to be talking about concepts of U.S. law, and so they may not necessarily apply to you if you are shooting your film or TV series outside the United States. And of course, also, if you find this video helpful, please like the video and subscribe to this channel. It really does help me in getting the word out to young, hungry, enterprising, independent filmmakers like yourself about legal issues that they confront in doing what they love to do. Anyway, in 1986, Salt-N-Pepa were working with a producer named Herb Azor, also known as Lovebug, who owned a company called Noise in the Attic Productions, or NITA. Salt-N-Pepa signed an agreement with NITA that had language saying, quote, "As between company and artist, company shall be the sole and exclusive owner of any and all rights, title, and/or interest in and to master recordings recorded hereunder, including but not limited to the world sound copyrights therein and the renewal rights therein." In other words, the agreement said that Azor's company would own the right to the master recordings that were recorded by Salt-N-Pepa while they were working with Azor. It didn't say that Salt-N-Pepa were licensing their copyrights or the right to distribute their copyrighted music to Azor. It didn't even say that Salt-N-Pepa were transferring their rights in the copyright outright to Azor. It simply said that Azor owned the copyrights in the master recordings. This language is where their troubles began. So there's a provision of the U.S. Copyright Act, Section 203, that essentially says that if a copyright owner transfers or licenses their copyright to someone, they can undo that transfer or license 35 years later. This gives artists who signed or licensed the copyrights in their creative works on terms that they later decide that they don't like, the right to reclaim their copyright. The goal of this is to help artists who sign deals early in their careers when they don't have as strong of a bargaining position to undo those deals after a lot of time has passed and hopefully make some more money than they did out of their original contract. By 2022, UMG had acquired the rights in Salt-N-Pepa's master recordings. Salt-N-Pepa wrote to UMG saying they were exercising their right under Section 203 to cancel the transfer of their copyrights to Azor under the 1986 agreement and recover those copyrights for themselves. UMG said, no, you can't do that because you've never actually owned the copyrights to begin with. So Salt-N-Pepa filed a lawsuit against UMG claiming that the U.S. Copyright Act required UMG to give them back the copyrights in their master recordings. Like I said, the judge ruled against Salt-N-Pepa. The judge looked at the 1986 contract with Azor and observed that it didn't say anywhere that Salt-N-Pepa owned the copyright in the master recordings. To the contrary, it said that Azor's company, NITA, was the, quote, sole and exclusive owner of those copyrights. So the way the agreement was written suggested to the judge that Salt-N-Pepa never actually owned the copyrights in their recordings to begin with. Because they never owned the copyrights in the first place, they couldn't have assigned or licensed those copyrights to Azor, and thus there was nothing for them to get back. So they couldn't rely on Section 203 of the Copyright Act to recover the copyrights. That's, of course, a disappointing result for Salt-N-Pepa. But how does that matter to independent film and TV creators? What this illustrates, I think, first and foremost, is that it's important to have a lawyer look at whatever contract you're thinking about signing, particularly if it has something to do with your rights to your copyright and your creative work. You want to make sure that the contract makes clear that you own the copyright, even if you're licensing the copyright to someone else or even selling it outright in exchange for money. If the contract doesn't make clear that you own the copyright, that creates the risk that in the really unfortunate event that you ever have to litigate with the other party to the agreement, a court might find that you not only don't own the copyright, but that in fact you never did to begin with. Another way to put this is that you want to make sure that a court doesn't find that your creative work, that is your film or your script or sound recording or whatever, was a so-called work made for hire, meaning that someone else hired you to make it. And that's because when a song or a script or whatever is a work made for hire, the person who created it does not actually own the rights in it. Instead, it's the entity or the person who hired them to create it. Also, you want to make sure that you register your copyright with the U.S. Copyright Office and say on your registration application that you're the owner of the copyright. That's the kind of evidence that will be helpful to you in the unfortunate event that you get into the kind of dispute that Salt-N-Pepa did. You might think that a contract that you're being offered is really straightforward and that you're saving money by not hiring a lawyer, but if you miss something important, you could be giving up a lot of money in the future, particularly if your creative work becomes super popular like Push It and Shoop did for Salt-N-Pepa. So I hope you found this video helpful, and thanks again for watching.